The corral gates swung open on a dry October morning in 1882, and Maggie Merriweather stood in the dust with her 7-year-old daughter pressed against her hip, and she said the words that cracked the sky open like a thunderclap over the Arizona territory. "Pick any horse in that corral, sweetheart. Pick anyone you like, because your mama earned them all." Little Clara Merriweather looked up at her mother with wide, stunned eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen too much in 7 short years. A burned homestead, a dead father, a season of hunger that had left its mark in the hollows of her small cheeks. But right now, standing in the golden dust of the finest horse ranch in Cobb County, with 30 magnificent animals tossing their manes in the morning light, Clara's eyes were not full of sorrow. They were full of wonder, and standing 10 feet back, one boot propped on the lowest rail of that same corral fence, Marshal Frank Trask watched Maggie Merriweather say those words to her daughter, and something inside his chest broke open in a way he had spent 3 hard years trying to prevent. He had known secrets about this woman before he ever loved her. He had known about the betrayal that had cost her everything. He had known about the dark past she carried like a stone around her throat. He had arrived in the town of Millhaven, Arizona, with a badge on his chest and a hidden motive tucked behind every polite word he'd ever spoken to her. He had told himself it was just the job. He had told himself that tracking down the stolen horses, finding the truth about what happened to the Merriweather homestead, and bringing justice to the men responsible was a cold, professional assignment. He had told himself a great many lies. And now he stood in the morning light watching Maggie Merriweather give her daughter the world, and every one of those lies turned to smoke. This is where it ended. Or rather, this is where it truly began. But to understand how Maggie Merriweather came to stand in that corral with 30 horses at her feet and a man quietly falling to pieces behind her, you have to go back. You have to go back to the night the Merriweather homestead burned. You have to go back to the moment everything she had was taken from her, and the long, brutal, breathtaking road she walked to take it all back. It was the spring of 1880 when the trouble truly started, though the seeds of it were planted long before Maggie Merriweather ever came to the Arizona territory. She had come west from Missouri with her husband, Thomas Merriweather, in 1876, the year Clara was born. Thomas was a capable man, strong-backed and quiet, the kind of man who believed that hard work and honest dealing were sufficient armor against the cruelties of the world. He was wrong about that, as many good men were, but he worked his land with devotion for 4 years and built something worth having, a modest horse breeding operation east of Millhaven, where the grass grew sweet along a creek called Copper Run, and where the land was flat enough for good pasture and wild enough to keep the neighbors far away. Maggie was the one who had the eye for horses. Thomas would have been the first to admit it. She could look at a yearling and tell you what it would become. She could see the heart of an animal in the way it held its head, in the way it stood in rain, in the way it responded to a firm hand versus a gentle one. The horses they bred on that little ranch were some of the finest in Cobb County, and people came from as far as Tucson to buy them. That was the problem. That was precisely the problem. A man named Caleb Dray took notice of the Merriweather horses in 1879, and what Caleb Dray noticed, Caleb Dray took. He was not a man who operated in open daylight. He was the kind of man who sent others to do his work while he stood in the shadows with clean hands and a pleasant smile. And in Millhaven in 1879, he was the kind of man who had the county commissioner in his pocket and a half-dozen hard men on his payroll and nobody to stop him. Thomas Merriweather tried to stop him. In the spring of 1880, Thomas discovered that 3 of his best breeding mares had been recorded in the county land office as belonging to Dray's operation, Dray's Consolidated Livestock, a fraudulent entry made possible by a corrupt clerk, and a falsified bill of sale that bore a version of Thomas's signature, close enough to fool a casual examination, different enough to damn any man who looked closely. But nobody in Millhaven was looking closely at anything Caleb Dray did. Thomas went to the county sheriff, a man named Orville Peck, who had been wearing Dre's money as casually as he wore his hat. Sheriff Peck listened to Thomas's complaint with a sympathetic expression and did absolutely nothing. Thomas then made the mistake of writing a letter to the territorial government in Prescott, detailing the fraud, naming Caleb Dre explicitly, and asking for a federal marshal to be sent to investigate. The letter was intercepted. Thomas was dead within a week. They made it look like a riding accident. A horse spooked on a rocky trail south of the creek. Thomas Merriweather, a man who had been riding horses since he was 5 years old and who had never once in his life been thrown, was found at the bottom of a ravine with a broken neck. Sheriff Peck ruled it an accident before the body was cold. Maggie knew. She knew in the way that a woman who has shared a bed and a life with a man for 4 years knows when something is wrong with the story she is being told. The horse that supposedly spooked was their oldest, gentlest gelding, a 17-year-old bay named Solomon who had never so much as sidestepped in all the years they had owned him. Solomon came home without a scratch. Thomas did not come home at all, but Maggie had Clara to think about. Clara was 4 years old and already motherless in the ways that mattered most, already learning to read the fear on adult faces, already learning that the world was not a safe place. Maggie grieved Thomas in the privacy of her own heart, and she kept her mouth shut, and she worked the ranch alone through the summer of 1880 with a rifle within arm's reach at all times and her ears tuned for horses in the dark. The fire came in August. She heard them coming, heard the hoofbeats, 3 or 4 horses at minimum, riding hard from the south. She had Clara out of bed and wrapped in a blanket and tucked behind the stone wall of the root cellar before the first torch hit the roof of the main house. She lay there in the dark with her daughter pressed against her chest, one hand over Clara's mouth to keep her quiet, listening to the crack and roar of everything she had built burning down above her. They took all 20 horses before they rode away, every single one. She heard the corral gate, heard the animals screaming and stamping as strangers forced them out into the dark. She heard men's voices, rough, laughing voices, and she pressed her lips against Clara's hair and breathed. When they were gone, she climbed out of the cellar with Clara on her hip and looked at what was left of her life. The main house was ash and standing timber. The small barn was half gone. Her horse, every horse, was gone. Her husband was 6 weeks in the ground. She had $40 in coins that she had sewn into the lining of her coat the week after Thomas died, because she had already known on some level that this was coming. She was 28 years old. She had a 4-year-old daughter, $40, the clothes on her back and nothing else. She walked into Millhaven at dawn. It took her 3 months to find a place to stand. She found work at the Millhaven Hotel, cleaning rooms and sometimes cooking when the regular cook was indisposed, which in Millhaven in 1880 meant frequently drunk. She rented a single room above a dry goods store from a widow named Mrs. Hatch, who was sharp-tongued and suspicious of everyone, but who had a soft spot for Clara that she worked very hard to disguise. Maggie paid her rent on time and kept her head down and asked no questions in public about Caleb Dre. In private, she asked every question she could think of. She found an ally in the most unexpected person, a young man named Emmett Yates, who worked as a stable hand at the livery, and who had, as it happened, been employed briefly at Dre's Consolidated Livestock the previous year before being dismissed for, as he put it, not being the kind of man they were looking for. Emmett was 19, idealistic in the way of someone who had not yet had those instincts beaten out of him, and he was deeply, uncomfortably aware that something wrong had been done to the Merriweather family, and that no one in Millhaven was going to do anything about it. He told Maggie things. Small things at first, the layout of Dre's operation, where he kept his books, which men worked for him, and which of those men had been part of the raid on her ranch. As the months passed and the trust between them grew, the information became more specific and more dangerous. Emmett had seen the horses, Maggie's horses. They were being held at a secondary property Dre kept in a canyon 15 miles east of town, a hidden place that did not appear on any county map. They were being rebranded slowly, carefully, with documentation that would make them appear to have always belonged to Dre. Maggie burned with the knowledge. She burned with it every day, and she kept the fire banked behind her practical brown eyes and her quiet manner and her unassuming position as the hotel cleaning woman. And she waited. She was waiting for something she could not have named precisely. She was waiting for a way through that would not get her killed the way Thomas had been killed, and would not leave Clara without both parents. She was waiting for some shift in the landscape that would give her the leverage she needed. That shift arrived in the form of Frank Trask in the spring of 1881. He rode into Millhaven on a gray horse, lean and dark-haired, with a federal marshal's badge on his coat and a face that gave away nothing. He was 32 years old, with the kind of stillness about him that comes from long practice of keeping the inside separate from the outside. He had been working for the U.S. Marshal's office out of Prescott for 6 years, and he had been assigned to the Merriweather case specifically because the letter Thomas had sent to the territorial government before his death had finally reached the right desk. The desk of a man named Deputy Marshal Harlan Oakes, who was neither corrupt nor indifferent, and who had quietly opened an investigation into Caleb Dre. Frank Trask's assignment was to go to Millhaven, establish himself, collect evidence, identify the men responsible for the theft and the arson, and he suspected, the murder of Thomas Merriweather, and build a case strong enough to bring before a federal judge. He was specifically instructed to keep the investigation covert. He was not to identify himself openly as a federal marshal until he had what he needed. He was not to make contact with Maggie Merriweather in any way that would draw attention to either of them. He checked into the Millhaven Hotel on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1881 and met Maggie Merriweather for the first time when she brought clean towels to his room. She knocked on the door frame. It was standing open to the afternoon air, and said, "Towels, sir," in a voice so even and composed that he thought immediately that this was a woman with a great deal going on behind her eyes that she was choosing not to show. He turned around from the window and looked at her, and the first thing he noticed was not her beauty, though she was beautiful in a worn, honest way, dark auburn hair pulled back severely, a light scatter of freckles across strong cheekbones, eyes the color of creek water in late afternoon. What he noticed first was her hands. She held the folded towels with the care of someone who had learned not to drop things, and her hands were red and rough from work, but they were absolutely steady. He took the towels and thanked her, and she nodded and left, and he turned back to the window and thought about what his hidden motive had just come very close to forgetting, that the woman he was in Millhaven to help was a real woman, not a name on a file, and that she was standing right in front of him, carrying something enormous with those steady hands. He kept his distance for 6 weeks. He took a job at the town's feed and grain store, which allowed him to observe the movements of Dre's men without drawing suspicion. He visited the county land office and made copies of the relevant records. He found Emmett Yates. It did not take long, because Emmett Yates was the sort of young man who practically vibrated with suppressed outrage, which made him noticeable, and after a careful period of establishing trust, began to share information in both directions. He saw Maggie at the hotel. He saw her in the mornings when he came down for breakfast, moving through the dining room with a coffee pot and an efficient, contained grace. He saw her on the street sometimes, walking Clara to the little school that had opened in the Methodist church. He watched her, and he told himself it was professional observation, and he lied to himself so effectively for a while that he almost believed it. The thing that broke the professional distance was not anything dramatic. It was a Thursday evening in June of 1881, when he came back to the hotel later than usual and found her sitting on the back steps, in the last of the daylight, with a small leather-bound book in her lap. She was writing in it quickly, with a concentration so absolute that she did not hear him come through the back door of the kitchen until he was almost beside her. She looked up without flinching, which told him something about her, that she had trained herself out of flinching, which meant she had spent time in a situation where flinching was a liability. "Mr. Trask," she said. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me." She closed the book and set it on her knee. "I was just finishing." He should have gone inside. He knew he should have gone inside. Instead, he said, "May I sit for a moment?" "It's a pleasant evening." She looked at him for a long moment with those creekwater eyes, and then she moved slightly to one side of the step and said, "If you like." He sat and they were quiet together for a moment, which was its own kind of conversation. The sky to the west was the color of a bruised peach, and the air smelled of dust and the faint sweetness of the desert sage that grew in the lot behind the hotel. "You used to have a horse ranch," he said, because he was tired of pretending he didn't know. She went very still, not afraid still, but careful still. "Most people in this town know that," she said. "It's not a secret." "No," he agreed. "The fire isn't a secret. What caused it might be." Another long pause. Then she said very quietly, "What exactly are you, Mr. Trask?" He looked at her and made a decision that was not strictly in keeping with his instructions. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and showed her the badge, just a brief flash, enough for her to read the words, and then he put it away. Her breath came out in one long, quiet release, like a woman who had been holding it for a year. "How long?" she asked. 6 weeks in Millhaven. The investigation has been open longer." "Thomas's letter," she said. "It reached the right person. Eventually." She turned to look at him then, fully, for the first time since they had sat down together, and what he saw on her face was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated than relief, the expression of a person who has been alone with something terrible for so long that the arrival of an ally produces not just gratitude but a grief that had been waiting for permission to show itself. He wanted, with a sudden and inconvenient force, to put his arm around her. He did not. "I have information," she said instead. "Considerable information. I have a source inside Dre's operation, and I have been keeping records for 9 months." He stared at her. "You've been running my own investigation, yes?" There was a thread of dry humor in her voice that he had not heard before, and it startled a smile out of him before he could prevent it. "I am aware that it has its limitations. I am one woman without legal authority in a town where the sheriff is owned by the man I'm trying to bring down, but I am not without resources." He looked at her, this woman who had lost her husband, her home, and every animal she had ever bred, who had walked into town with $40 and a 4-year-old, and who had spent the following year quietly building a case against the most powerful criminal in Cobb County. And he felt something move in his chest that he categorically refused to examine. "Tell me what you have," he said. She told him. It took most of the evening. When she was done, he sat in the growing dark with the scope of what she had gathered arranged in his mind like a map, and he understood that she had not been waiting for rescue. She had been waiting for a partner. The partnership changed everything. Over the following months, they met carefully, never in the hotel, never anywhere that Dre's men might observe them together and draw conclusions. They met at Emmett Yates' small house at the edge of town, and later at the Hatch widow's kitchen table, because Mrs. Hatch had turned out to know a great deal more than she let on, and harbored a grudge against Caleb Dre that went back years, and involved a land dispute that had cost her late husband 6 months of legal fees and his pride. The information they assembled was meticulous. Frank used his authority as a federal officer to obtain documents from the Territorial Land Office in Prescott, comparing them against the falsified county records. Emmett provided witness testimony. He had seen the branded horses, had watched the rebranding operation, knew the names of the men who had done it. Mrs. Hatch produced, from a locked box under her bed, a collection of documents her husband had gathered during his own ill-fated attempt to resist Dre's practices, including a signed affidavit from a man who had since moved to California, but who had witnessed the creation of a fraudulent bill of sale in 1878. And Maggie's records, the careful, detailed records she had kept in that small leather-bound book, turned out to be the spine of the whole thing. She had dates, observations, names, and connections laid out with a logical precision that Frank found himself admiring with something that went well beyond professional appreciation. She was, he thought, the most impressive person he had ever worked alongside, which was the point at which he recognized that he was in serious trouble. He was scrupulously careful not to let it show. He was professional and measured, and he kept the appropriate distance in all their meetings, and he told himself with diminishing conviction that once the case was resolved, he would leave Millhaven and that would be the end of it. The case would be his boundary. His professional obligation was the wall between what he felt and what he was permitted to feel. Maggie, for her part, was not unaware of him. She was, in fact, uncomfortably aware of him in ways she had not expected and did not entirely welcome. She had loved Thomas Merriweather with the steady, deep love of a good marriage, and Thomas had been gone less than 2 years, and she had not anticipated the particular discomfort of noticing that Frank Trask had a way of listening to her that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could measure, fully seen. She noticed the stillness in him, which was different from coldness. She noticed the care with which he treated Clara on the rare occasions when they crossed paths. He was not effusive with the child, which would have been false, but he was attentive in small ways, remembered that Clara liked horses and brought her once a carved wooden horse from the general store, presenting it with a casual matter-of-factness that made Clara's face light up and made Maggie's heart do something complicated and unwanted. She told herself the same things he was telling himself. She had a child to protect. She had a mission to complete. There was no room in her life and no room in her heart for the particular kind of dangerous distraction that Frank Trask represented. The case broke open in January of 1882. Emmett came to them with news that Caleb Dray was planning to move the horses, all of them, the entire hidden herd, which by that point had grown to 30 animals through subsequent thefts from other small ranchers in the territory, to a buyer in New Mexico. He had a contact, a man who dealt in horses without asking questions about provenance, and the sale was planned for the end of the month. Once the horses crossed into New Mexico and changed hands, the physical evidence of the theft would be gone, and the case would rest entirely on paperwork, which Dray's lawyers, he had 2, very expensive ones from Tucson, would shred before a sympathetic judge. They had 3 weeks. Frank sent an urgent communication to Deputy Marshal Oakes in Prescott requesting authority to make arrests and backup deputies to assist. The territorial government moved slowly, because territorial governments always moved slowly, and Frank spent the first week of January pacing the floor of Emmett's small house and managing the expression on his face around Maggie so that she did not see how close to the edge of the deadline they were cutting. She saw it anyway. She was not a woman from whom things were easily hidden. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said on a cold Wednesday evening while Emmett had stepped outside to see to his horses, and Mrs. Hatch was in the next room with Clara, teaching her to play checkers. "I'm not afraid," he said, which was a reflex and a lie, and they both knew it. "Frank." It was the first time she had used his given name without the title before it, and it struck him like a hand on his shoulder, direct, warm, impossible to ignore. "We have been building this case for 8 months together. I have been building this case for longer. I trust you to be honest with me." He met her eyes. He said, "The backup may not arrive in time. The authorization may not arrive in time. If Dray moves those horses before we have the authority and the manpower to stop him, we lose the physical evidence, and without the physical evidence, the paperwork case is survivable for a man with his resources. Not ironclad, survivable." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if we don't wait for the authorization?" "That's not," he stopped. "What if the horses are moved somewhere that is not New Mexico?" she said carefully. "What if they are moved somewhere that Dray's men are not expecting, by people who know the canyon where they're being held before Dray's own transport arrives?" He stared at her. "Maggie, that would be, I cannot officially sanction. "I am not asking you to sanction anything," she said. "I am telling you what I am considering doing. As a private citizen attempting to recover stolen property that belongs to me, and to the other ranchers in this county whose horses are in that canyon." The silence stretched between them like a wire. "If something went wrong," he started. "If something went wrong, it would go wrong for me," she said. "And that is my calculation to make." He looked at her face in the lamplight, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes, the combination of fear and absolute determination that had been there since the first time he saw her, and he said, in a voice that was considerably rougher than he intended, "I will not let something go wrong." She looked at him. Really looked at him. And the thing that had been building quietly between them for 8 months of careful, professional, disciplined partnership filled the room like a held breath. "That is not your decision either," she said softly. "No," he said, "but I intend to be there." The plan they built over the following week was intricate and required the cooperation of 4 people: Maggie, Frank, Emmett, and a rancher named Gil Sandoval, whose horses made up 8 of the 30 animals in Dre's hidden canyon. Gil Sandoval was 55 years old, as wide as a doorframe, and had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity with the patience of a man who had survived enough injustice to know that the wheel turned eventually. He also knew the canyon roads in that part of the territory better than anyone alive, because he had spent 20 years running cattle through them. They went on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of January, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the ground was hard, and the moon was just past full, giving them enough light to work by and enough darkness to cover their approach. Frank had, in the 10 days since Maggie had presented her plan, received a partial communication from Prescott. Not the full authorization, not the backup deputies, but a letter from Deputy Marshal Oakes confirming that the investigation was approved, that Frank's actions to that point were sanctioned, and that he had the authority to make arrests pending the arrival of additional officers, which Oakes estimated at 2 weeks out. It was not everything Frank had asked for. It was enough to act. They approached the canyon from the north, where the wall of rock curved back in a way that Dre's guards, 2 of them, stationed at the main entrance to the south, could not see. Gil Sandoval led the way on foot for the last half-mile, moving with a silence that belied his size. Emmett came next, then Frank, then Maggie, who had refused to stay behind with a quiet ferocity that had settled the matter completely. She had Thomas's rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, which she had kept through everything: the fire, the flight, the year of hotel work, because it was the last thing of his she had, and because she knew, with the practicality of a frontier woman, that she might need it. There was a third guard that their intelligence had not accounted for, a young man posted inside the canyon near the horses themselves, and it was Maggie who saw him first, saw the orange glow of his cigarette in the dark, and touched Frank's arm and stopped the whole group with that single touch. Frank neutralized the situation without violence. He came at the young guard from behind with his badge in hand and a very specific, very quiet authority in his voice. And the guard, who was 17 and doing a job for pay that he now clearly understood was more dangerous than advertised, sat down on the ground and stayed there with his hands behind his head and caused no further trouble. The horses recognized Maggie. This was the thing that none of them had entirely planned for, the moment when 20 horses that had lived in her pasture and drunk from her creek and been handled by her hands for years caught her scent in the cold canyon air and began to move toward her at once, a slow, warm tide of horsehide and breath, nickering softly, pressing their noses into her hands and her shoulders and her face. She stood in the middle of them with her rifle hanging loose at her side, and she let them come to her, and she made no sound at all, but Frank, watching her, could see the way her shoulders shook once briefly before she steadied herself. He looked away to give her the moment and found Gil Sandoval watching the same thing with his old face working with emotion, because 8 of those horses were his, and the reunion was the same for them. Those animals knew the man who had bred them. They moved the horses out of the canyon in 3 groups over the course of 2 hours, leading them north along the route Gil Sandoval knew in his sleep. Each group spaced far enough apart that they did not spook each other or make excessive noise. It was the most painstaking 2 hours of Frank's professional life, and the most quietly alive he had ever felt in it. By the time Dre's men arrived at the main entrance to the canyon the following morning expecting to begin the transport to New Mexico, the canyon was empty, and 2 of Dre's guards were secured with their hands tied to a length of fence rail, left with a written note signed by U.S. Marshal Frank Trask explaining the legal situation in precise, unmistakable terms. The horses were secured at Gil Sandoval's ranch, which was the closest defensible property, and Frank sent Emmett to Millhaven at first light with a message for Sheriff Orville Peck that was carefully worded to inform the sheriff that the federal government was now in active oversight of any further activity related to Caleb Dre, and that any interference would be prosecuted accordingly. It was a warning and a trap simultaneously, because Frank had documentation of Peck's complicity in the fraud, and Peck, who was ultimately a coward in the way of men who have borrowed someone else's power, correctly read the situation and stayed in his office for the next 2 weeks, which was all the time Frank needed. The backup deputies arrived from Prescott 11 days after the horses were moved. They brought with them the full written authorization for arrest, a warrant signed by a federal judge, and Deputy Marshal Oakes himself, who had decided that a case of this magnitude warranted his personal attention. Caleb Dre was arrested on a Friday morning at his home outside Millhaven. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the sleek appearance of someone who has never done a day of physical labor in his life, and he looked at the federal officers on his doorstep with an expression of cold outrage that shifted, as the warrant was read to him, into something more calculating, and then into something that Frank recognized as fear. He made no physical resistance. He was not that kind of man. He made lawyer noises and sent a rider immediately for his men in Tucson, but the rider was stopped at the county line by Deputy Marshal Oakes, who had anticipated that move. Sheriff Peck resigned the same afternoon without prompting, which was an admission of his own, and which Oakes documented carefully for subsequent proceedings. 3 of Dre's men were arrested on the same day, including 2 who Emmett Yates identified as having been present the night of the Merriweather arson. A 4th man, the one whose name Maggie had been most afraid of, a rough, cold-eyed individual named Holt, who had been pointed out to her once by Emmett, as the man who had personally led the raid, was found at a saloon in the next town and brought back in handcuffs by one of the Prescott deputies. Maggie watched him brought into the federal custody, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the Millhaven Hotel with Clara's hand in hers, and she watched him pass, and she said nothing. She did not need to say anything. Her face said enough. The legal process moved forward from there with the deliberateness of federal machinery. Dre and his men were removed to Prescott for trial. The evidence was comprehensive and well documented. The lawyers from Tucson made noise for several months and accomplished nothing meaningful against the weight of what Frank and Maggie and Emmett and Gil Sandoval had assembled. Caleb Dre was convicted of fraud, theft, conspiracy, and arson in September of 1882. Holt and the 2 men identified in the arson were convicted alongside him. Dre received 12 years in the territorial prison. The others received sentences commensurate with their participation. The murder of Thomas Merriweather was investigated as well, though proving it legally, given that the manner of death had been officially ruled an accident and the physical evidence was 2 years cold, was more difficult. The investigation remained open. 2 of Dre's men, in negotiations for reduced sentences, provided statements that confirmed the murder had been ordered, if not its precise execution. It was not the full justice that Thomas deserved. It was what was available, and Maggie accepted it with the clear-eyed realism that she applied to everything. The horses were returned. Not just Maggie's horses. All 30 animals in the hidden corral were identified and attributed to their rightful owners, with Gil Sandoval recovering his 8, 2 other small ranchers recovering theirs, and Maggie recovering 17. The additional 13 horses in the corral had been stolen from ranchers who had since left the territory, driven out by Dre's campaign of pressure and intimidation. And after the federal proceedings, those animals were formally awarded to Maggie Merriweather in partial compensation for the destruction of her property, the loss of her husband's life, and the years of material harm done to her family. 30 horses, all hers. Which was how she came to be standing at the corral gate on a clear October morning in 1882, with her 7-year-old daughter at her hip, saying the words that had split Frank Trask open like a book. But there was the matter of Frank himself. And that matter was not yet resolved. He had been present through all of it, the arrests, the legal process, the return of the animals. He had stayed in Millhaven well beyond the operational requirements of his assignment, and Deputy Marshal Oakes had noticed this with the professional acuteness of a man who had been doing this job for 20 years. "You planning to take root here, Trask?" Oakes had asked him, not unkindly, 2 weeks before the trial verdict came through. "I'm seeing the case through," Frank had said. "The case is through," Oakes said, "or very nearly. The question is whether you are." Frank had not answered that question. He had not answered it because he did not yet know the answer, and he was honest enough with himself, alone in his rented room at the Millhaven Hotel, to admit that what was holding him in Millhaven was not the case. After the morning at the corral, after Clara ran into the enclosure with her arms wide and began moving from horse to horse with the fearless joy of a child who has been waiting her entire life for exactly this moment, Frank came to stand beside Maggie at the fence. They watched her together, the little girl and the horses, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "She loves them," Frank said. "She grew up with horses before she grew up with much else," Maggie said. "Even at 4, she could already feel what they were feeling. She has the gift." Like her mother, Maggie glanced at him, and there was a warmth in it that she did not try to suppress. Thomas used to say the same thing. The mention of Thomas sat quietly between them, not as an obstruction but as something real that belonged to the conversation, to the fabric of who she was, and how she had come to be standing in this place. "He was right to say it," Frank said. "And whatever he built here, what you built here together, you carried it forward when he couldn't. Everything that happened since was you, Maggie. The investigation, the evidence, the plan in that canyon. I was the badge and the authority, but you were the spine of it." She was quiet for a moment. Clara had found a bay mare near the far side of the corral and was already talking to her in a low, serious murmur, and the mare was listening with her ears pricked forward, completely attentive to this small person. "I couldn't have done it alone," Maggie said. "I want to be honest about that. I spent a year building what I had, and without you, it would have sat in a ledger book and amounted to nothing." "Then we needed each other," he said. She looked at him fully then in the direct, unflinching way she had, no coyness, no evasion, just the full, honest weight of her attention. "Yes," she said, "I believe we did. It was not a declaration, but it was something," he said carefully. "I've been thinking about what comes next." For the case, she knew it wasn't. She asked anyway. "For me," he said. "Oakes has offered me a posting in Prescott, full-time territorial office. It's a good position." She did not say anything immediately. She watched Clara scratch the bay mare's nose. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Prescott?" "Not particularly," he said. "No," another pause, a longer one. The horses moved gently in the autumn light, and Clara's voice drifted to them, light and happy, and overhead a hawk made its slow circle against the blue. "I need to rebuild," Maggie said. "The house, the operation. I have the horses now, which is the beginning of everything. But it will take time and it will take work, and it will not be a comfortable thing for the first few years. It will be a hard thing." "I know hard things," Frank said. "I've been doing them for a while." "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quietly. "I know you're not," he said. "That's not what this is." She turned to look at him again, and this time what was on her face was not guarded or measured but simply open, in the way of a person who has decided to stop protecting themselves from something they cannot protect themselves from anyway. "Frank," she said. "Maggie," he said. And then Clara's voice rose from inside the corral. "Mama, Mama, this one. She likes me, Mama, look." They both looked. The bay mare had lowered her head and was breathing gently against Clara's outstretched palm, and Clara was standing perfectly still the way Maggie had taught her, still and quiet. Let the horse come to you. And the whole picture of it, the child and the horse in the autumn light, was so precisely, painfully beautiful that Maggie made a small sound beside him that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "That's Solomon's granddaughter," Maggie said softly. "I bred her dam myself. She was a foal the year we lost." She stopped, steadied. "She was a foal the year everything changed." Frank said nothing. He reached out and took Maggie's hand, which was resting on the top rail of the fence, and covered it with his own, and she looked down at his hand on hers, and she did not pull away. They stood like that for a long time, watching Clara fall in love with a horse, while the October light moved slowly across the land. He did not go to Prescott. He wrote to Deputy Marshal Oakes and declined the posting with professional courtesy, and Oakes wrote back a response that was 3 lines long and concluded with, "I expected nothing different, Trask. Good luck to you," which Frank read with a reluctant smile and tucked away as a keepsake. He stayed in Millhaven. He found a place to be useful. The town was without a law officer after Peck's resignation, and while Frank's federal posting would not continue indefinitely, he had enough standing and enough community trust to accept the position of town marshal, while the county organized a proper election for a new sheriff. It was a temporary arrangement that he understood might become something more permanent, and he accepted it with a clarity that surprised him. The badge felt different, worn for a town that knew him, rather than as a cover for an undercover investigation. It felt honest. Like he was standing in the right place in the right way, finally, after years of operating in the careful shadows of other people's dishonesty. Maggie's rebuild began in October, once the legal proceedings were fully concluded and the horses were officially and permanently hers. Gil Sandoval helped. He arrived one morning with 2 of his ranch hands and a wagon full of lumber, and said, in his direct and uncomplicated way, that he intended to help rebuild the Merriweather property because what had happened there was a wrong that the whole county bore some responsibility for, and he was not the kind of man who left debts unpaid. Emmett Yates came too, and turned out to be an extraordinarily competent carpenter when he had the right tools and supervision, which surprised everyone including himself. Mrs. Hatch organized the women of the town's Methodist congregation, who arrived in a rotation that included food preparation and child-minding services that meant Maggie could work on the house without constantly worrying about Clara. Frank came on his days off from his marshal duties, which were plentiful in that first quiet season after Dre's conviction, when the town was breathing out after years of living under a corrupt thumb. He was not a fancy carpenter, but he was strong and methodical, and he followed Gil's direction well. And there was a particular afternoon in November when he was working on the roof of the new main house, and Maggie climbed up to bring him coffee, and they sat together on the unfinished ridge beam with the whole sweep of the Arizona territory laid out below them, and the air so clear and cold it was like drinking water. And she said, almost to herself, "It's going to be beautiful." "It already is," he said, and was looking at her when he said it, which she noticed and did not comment on, but the color that came into her face had nothing to do with the cold. The new house was mostly complete by Christmas of 1882. It was smaller than the original but solidly built, with a stone fireplace that Gil Sandoval's oldest hand had laid himself, and a kitchen that was twice the size of the one that had burned, because Maggie had specific ideas about kitchens. Clara had a room of her own for the first time since the fire, a small room with a window that looked out toward the corral, and she went to sleep every night looking at the shapes of the horses in the moonlight, which she said was the best possible thing to look at before sleeping. Frank had supper at the Merriweather place for the first time on Christmas Eve, along with Gil and Emmett and Mrs. Hatch and 4 or 5 others who had become the informal extended family that the winter had assembled around Maggie's table. It was warm and loud and full of food, and Clara sat beside Frank and showed him how to play checkers. She had become quite good under Mrs. Hatch's instruction, and Frank, who had not spent a Christmas with other people in at least 4 years, found himself sitting back at one point and looking around the table with a specific, nameable emotion that he had not expected. He wanted this. He wanted exactly this, not something like it, not an approximation. This table and these people and this woman moving between the kitchen and the dining room with a dish towel over her shoulder, and the flush of warmth on her face, and the certainty of a person in their right place. He told her after dinner, when the others had gone, and Clara was in bed, and they were washing the supper dishes together in the comfortable way of 2 people who have worked alongside each other long enough to fall into domestic rhythm without self-consciousness. He told her in the simple, direct way that he had learned from watching her, no elaborate preamble, no deflection, just the honest truth of the matter. "I love you, Maggie," he said, his hands in the dishwater, not looking at her. "I have loved you for the better part of a year, and I am aware that the timing of that is complicated by everything that has happened, and I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give, but I needed you to know it, because I'm done keeping things from you." She was very still for a moment. Then she set down the plate she was drying and she turned to him, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw in a gesture that was so tender and so direct that it stopped his breath entirely. "Frank Trask," she said, "do you think I don't know?" He looked at her. "Do you think I have spent a year working alongside you, building something with you, trusting you with everything I had and didn't know?" Her voice was soft but not uncertain. There was no uncertainty in this woman. There never had been. "I know. I have known for a long time. I have been waiting for myself to be ready to say it back." He put his wet hand over hers where it rested against his face. "Are you ready?" he asked, and his voice was very careful and very quiet. "Yes," she said. "I am. I love you, Frank. You came here with a hidden motive and no idea what you were walking into, and you stayed for the right reasons, and you have been the steadiest thing I have had in the last 18 months, and I love you. That is the whole truth of it." He kissed her then. It was not a desperate kiss or a dramatic one. It was exactly what they were: careful, strong, warm, and absolutely certain. It tasted like Christmas and honesty and the long end of a very hard road. Clara, who was not actually asleep, but had been listening from the hallway with considerable interest, made a soft sound of satisfaction and padded back to her room. They were married in March of 1883 in the Methodist church that had housed Millhaven School, officiated by the minister who had also taught Clara to read. Gil Sandoval stood up with Frank. Emmett Yates, who cried unexpectedly and with great sincerity, stood on Frank's other side. Mrs. Hatch held Clara's hand throughout the ceremony and told her with unnecessary firmness to stop fidgeting, while actually being the person most likely to fidget. Maggie wore a dress the color of cream that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, with a small spray of dried wildflowers in her hair, because nothing in the territory was blooming yet but the desert verbena she had gathered and pressed in the fall. She walked down the aisle of the small church on her own, because she needed no one to give her away. She had given herself to this, freely and fully, and in complete knowledge of what she was choosing. Frank watched her walk toward him and thought that he had spent 34 years being competent and careful and frequently alone, and that all of it, every hard mile of it, had been worth it for this moment and this woman. They spoke simple vows, not the formal ones but words they had written themselves, honest and plain and specifically theirs. When Frank said, "I take you as my partner in everything, in work and in living and in whatever comes next," the word partner made Maggie's eyes fill, because it was the right word, the exact right word, and he had known it was. Clara, released from Mrs. Hatch's hand at the appropriate moment, ran to them both the second it was done, and threw her arms around their middles simultaneously, and the whole church laughed. The spring and summer of 1883 were full of building. The horse operation was expanding, because Maggie's reputation for breeding quality animals had preceded her return, and orders began coming in from around the county and beyond. The animals she had bred and lost and recovered carried the quality she had always known was in them, and their offspring carried it further. Frank managed his marshal duties and spent his evenings helping with the ranch work, which he had not done before in his life, and which he found, to his considerable surprise, deeply satisfying. There was a particular peace in the physical work of a horse ranch: the feeding and grooming, the careful management of breeding pairs, the slow, attentive process of working with young horses until they trusted human hands. That was unlike the constant vigilance and concealment of investigative work. He found he preferred it. He gave up the marshal's badge in the fall of 1883, when the county had organized a proper election and voted in a new sheriff from among the local ranchers. A straightforward, honest man named Beaumont who had no connections to Dre's operation and no patience for corruption. Frank's temporary position had served its purpose. He was ready to let it go. He was, for the first time in many years, simply a man on a ranch with a wife and a daughter and a future that looked like the thing he was building it toward. Clara turned 8 that October, and her birthday present was the bay mare, the Solomon granddaughter she had chosen from the corral on that morning that still lived in all of them like a bright stone. The mare had been with Maggie through the breeding season and had been a steady, willing animal throughout, and she was ready for a young rider, and Clara was more than ready for her. They called her Coppergrace, which was Clara's name for her, chosen on the basis that the mare's coat was the color of a bright penny, and her movements were as smooth and flowing as anything Clara had ever seen. The name stuck immediately and seemed to suit the animal perfectly. Clara rode Coppergrace every day that the weather permitted, with Maggie or Frank alongside on one of the other horses, and she learned with the same natural authority that her mother had shown from the beginning, sitting the saddle like she had been born in one, communicating with the animal through small shifts in weight and pressure rather than force. "She'll be better than you by the time she's 12, Frank told Maggie one evening, watching Clara trot a careful circle in the near pasture. "She already is in some ways," Maggie said, with a pride so warm it was practically a physical presence. "She has the instinct I had to learn. It comes to her naturally." "Like her mother," Frank said. Maggie looked at him with a sideways smile that had become one of his favorite things in the world. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." In the spring of 1884, Maggie told Frank she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, in the same direct, factual way she told him everything, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had learned to read as the one he wore when something had happened that exceeded his capacity to respond to immediately. "Well," he said, after a moment. "Well," she agreed. He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her with his face against her hair for a long time without saying anything else, and she held him back. And outside the kitchen window, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings do in the Arizona territory, filling itself with light and the smell of new growth and the distant sound of horses. Clara received the news with a seriousness that suggested she had been giving the matter prior thought. "A brother," she said firmly. "I would like a brother, please. The matter is not entirely in our hands," Frank told her. "Mostly yours, though," Clara said, which made Maggie inhale a startled laugh and made Frank cover his face with one hand. The baby was a boy. He was born in November of 1884 in the bedroom of the house they had built, with the midwife from town and Mrs. Hatch and Gil Sandoval's wife, Rosaria, in attendance. Frank spent the labor in the kitchen being quietly, methodically useless in the way of men of his era, making coffee that no one wanted and then not drinking it himself, until Rosaria Sandoval came and told him firmly to go outside and walk until he was called. He walked. He walked the perimeter of the near pasture in the cold November dark with Coppergrace pacing him on the other side of the fence, curious and attentive the way horses are around events they do not understand, but can sense the weight of. And he thought about everything that had brought him to this ranch and this night, and he was grateful with the specific, aching gratitude of someone who knows precisely how close they came to missing it. The boy was born just before midnight and was, by every possible measure, completely healthy, possessed of his mother's auburn coloring and his father's dark eyes, and an obvious and immediate opinion about the world that he expressed loudly and at length. They named him Thomas Francis Trask. Thomas for the man who had built the beginning of what they had, and whose absence was still a presence in the house in the form of Clara's memories and Maggie's quiet moments, and the carving of a horse on the mantelpiece that had come from the original house, salvaged from the ashes because Maggie had gone back for it. Francis for Frank's own father, a Missouri man who had died when Frank was young, and whose steady, quiet character Frank had spent his life trying to measure up to. Clara, when she was first brought in to see her new brother and Frank was watching from the doorway, looked at the infant in Maggie's arms with an expression of profound assessment. Then she reached out one careful finger and touched his hand, and the baby's fingers closed around hers with the reflex grip of the newborn, and Clara's face broke open into a smile of pure delight. "He's strong," she announced. "Good." Thomas grew into a cheerful, physical child, who was devoted to his sister, with an intensity that Clara handled with the patient grace of an older sibling who takes her responsibilities seriously. He was on horseback by the time he was 4, which was earlier than Maggie had intended but impossible to prevent because every time she turned around, Frank had him up in the saddle of one of the gentler horses, holding the reins with absolute seriousness. "You are encouraging this," Maggie told Frank. "He asked," Frank said. "He's your son, he has opinions." "He's 4. He's very confident 4, Frank said. The horse operation continued to grow through the mid-1880s, reaching a scale that put Maggie Merriweather Trask's name firmly on the map of serious breeders in the Arizona Territory. She had a specific reputation for horses with both temperament and physical soundness, which was rarer than it should have been, and which came from the patient, knowledge-based approach she had always taken. She could be seen most mornings in the round pen, working with young horses in the way she had always worked with presence and patience, and a respect for the animal's own intelligence that was unusual in a time when horses were commonly treated as equipment rather than creatures with minds of their own. Emmett Yates, who had stayed in Millhaven and grown into a capable man in his mid-20s, became her primary employee in 1885, when the scale of the operation exceeded what she and Frank could manage alone. He was good with the horses and better with the books than he gave himself credit for, and his deep and abiding loyalty to the Merriweather cause, which had started as youthful idealism and matured into genuine affection and respect, made him the kind of employee who was essentially irreplaceable. He married a young woman named Pearl from a neighboring ranch in 1886, and their wedding supper was held at the Merriweather Trask Ranch, because Maggie insisted and because Emmett would have had it nowhere else. In the summer of 1886, Maggie received a letter. It came from California, from the man whose affidavit had helped build the original case against Caleb Dre, an older man named Harwell, who had left the territory years before and whose testimony had been one of the crucial pieces of the puzzle. He wrote to say that he had seen news of the Dre conviction in a California newspaper, and that he had been glad of it, and that he hoped Mrs. Merriweather, he still used her original name, had found some measure of justice and peace. Maggie wrote back and told him what had happened. She told him about the horses and the ranch and the legal outcome, and she told him about Frank, and she told him that she had found considerably more than just justice and peace, and that she hoped his own life was good. The letter that came back was warm and brief and ended with, "Tell the Marshal I am glad the territory has men of that kind in it. They are not as common as they should be." She showed it to Frank at supper that evening, and he read it and looked up with that expression she loved, the one that meant he was feeling more than he planned to say. "He's right," Clara said, who had also read the letter, being at an age where reading all available correspondence was a personal policy. "You are good, Frank." Frank looked at his stepdaughter, who was 11 and growing into someone who was going to be formidable and magnificent, and said, "Thank you, Clara." "I call you Frank still," she said, with the directness that was entirely her mother's. "But in my head I call you Dad. I have for a while. I just wanted you to know." The silence that followed this announcement had a texture to it. Frank set the letter down very carefully. Maggie watched him with soft eyes. "You can call me that," Frank said. "Whichever way, in your head or out loud. Either way." Clara nodded, satisfied, and returned to her supper with the composure of someone who has said a necessary thing and considers the matter settled. Thomas, who was 2 and comprehending approximately half of any given conversation, looked around the table at the adults and said, "More bread," which successfully broke the solemnity of the moment in the way only a 2-year-old can. The second pregnancy came in 1887, announced at breakfast again in the same direct Tuesday morning way, and this time Frank did not set down his coffee cup. He simply reached across the table and took her hand without a word, and she squeezed it, and that was their whole conversation about it. "Is it a girl?" Clara asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her riding boots already on at 6 in the morning, because she had heard the announcement being made. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Maggie said. "I would like a sister," Clara said. "Thomas could use some balance." Thomas, at the table with his porridge, looked up and said, "I'm balanced." "You are emphatically not," Clara told him, but kindly. This baby was a girl, born in the spring of 1888, and the birth was easier than Thomas's had been, shorter, calmer, though no less momentous. They named her Rose Emmeline Trask, Rose for the desert rose that was blooming when she arrived, and Emmeline for Frank's mother, who had been a strong woman in her own right and whose name deserved to carry forward. Rose grew into a child of extraordinary sweetness and stubborn will in equal measure, which was, as Maggie observed to Frank privately, exactly the combination you got when you mixed his mother's character with her own. "That sounds like a warning," Frank said. "It is absolutely a warning," Maggie confirmed, "and also the best possible thing." He laughed, which was one of her favorite sounds, the easy, real laugh that had taken months of knowing him before she first heard it, and which she had worked, without his awareness, to bring out as often as possible ever since. By 1889, the Merriweather Trask Ranch was 40 acres of productive, well-managed land with a herd of 38 horses of various breeds and purposes, a small but growing reputation across the territory, and a waiting list for the breeding season that had grown long enough to make Maggie somewhat dizzy when she looked at it. Clara was 14 and was, as predicted, a better rider than her mother in several specific respects, particularly in the intuitive communication between rider and horse that transcended technique. She had already won 2 local competitions in the equestrian events that were beginning to organize themselves around the county fairs, and she had an opinion about every horse on the property that was detailed, specific, and usually correct. She was also, as Maggie confided to Frank one evening, becoming very beautiful in a way that was going to require certain conversations relatively soon. "I'll handle the horses," Frank said. "You handle that." "The fairness of that division is debatable," Maggie told him. "I cannot debate it," Frank said. "I am terrified." She laughed at him, which was also one of his favorite things. There was very little in the life they had built together that was not one of his favorite things. The decade moved forward with the particular rhythm of a life that is working as it should, not without difficulty, because no life is without difficulty, and the territory had its own demands and its own cruelties. There were bad seasons and hard winters, and the loss of horses to illness despite every precaution. And there were the broader changes of the era overtaking the landscape in ways that could not be resisted. The railroad was changing everything about how goods and animals moved across the territory. The homestead boom was bringing more and more people onto land that had not always been occupied peacefully, and the tensions that produced were real and often unjust, and Maggie had enough history with injustice to take them seriously. She was involved, in the early 1890s, in a local organizing effort among the smaller ranchers of Cobb County to establish cooperative practices for the fair pricing of horses and the legal protection of small operations against the kind of consolidation that Caleb Dray had once attempted through criminal means, but that others were beginning to attempt through legal ones. It was the same fight in a different form, and she brought the same patient, thorough, documentation-based approach to it that she had brought to everything else. Frank found himself, not for the first time, watching her work and being struck by the specific combination of intelligence and tenacity and deep ethical seriousness that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "You could have been a lawyer," he said once, watching her prepare a document for the Ranchers Association. "Women cannot be lawyers," she said. "You could have been the kind of woman who makes lawyers unnecessary," he said. She looked up at him. "That is an extremely well-constructed compliment, Frank Trask. I have had practice," he said. "You have," she agreed and went back to her work, but smiling. Thomas, growing up tall and broad-shouldered and fundamentally cheerful in the way of people who have been loved consistently since birth, showed an interest in law enforcement that Frank observed with mixed feelings, the professional appreciation of a former Marshal, and the fatherly anxiety of a man who knew exactly what that work entailed. He talked to the boy honestly about both sides of it, and Thomas, at 15, received this information with the seriousness it deserved, and said that he was going to think about it. Rose was, as advertised, a complexity of sweetness and steel that kept everyone in the household alert. She loved horses with Clara's same instinct, but expressed it differently. Where Clara was quietly authoritative with animals, Rose was openly affectionate, conducting long and serious conversations with the horses in the manner of someone who is certain they are being understood and is largely correct. The horses responded to her with a consistency that was, as Frank said, both entirely natural and slightly uncanny. The year 1893 brought two things of note to the Merriweather Trask household. The first was that Clara, at 18, won the Cobb County Fair's main equestrian competition on Coppergrace, who was now 11 years old and as fine and willing an animal as she had ever been. It was a thorough and unambiguous victory, and the county took note, and an inquiry came afterward from a gentleman in Tucson who was building a serious breeding operation and wanted to discuss the possibility of purchasing some of the Merriweather Trask bloodlines. The resulting business arrangement was the most significant economic transaction the ranch had conducted, and it secured the operation's financial future in a way that removed a category of worry from Maggie's mind for the first time in over a decade. The second thing was that Emmett Yates, who had been with the ranch for 8 years by this point and who was now 31, came to Frank and Maggie and said with characteristic earnestness that he had been offered a position managing a larger horse operation in the next county, and that while his loyalty was absolute and he would stay if they needed him, he felt it was time to build something of his own. Frank and Maggie let him go without hesitation, with full endorsements and genuine pride, and a farewell dinner that included Gil Sandoval and his wife and Mrs. Hatch, who was 72 by now and as formidable as ever, and who told Emmett that she expected great things and would be watching from a distance. Emmett left with tears in his eyes and the most glowing reference letter that Frank had ever written, which he composed with the care of someone who understands that a letter of reference is sometimes the most useful thing you can give a person. Clara replaced him, essentially. She took over the day-to-day management of the horse operation with an authority that surprised no one who knew her and impressed everyone who didn't. She had her mother's eye and her mother's organizational mind, and her own considerable additions to both, and the ranch under her management in the mid-1890s continued to grow in reputation and production. There was a young man who came to work at the ranch in 1895, a capable and honest fellow named Daniel who had come up from New Mexico following the reputation of the Merriweather Trask breeding program. He was 23 and knew horses with the ease of someone raised among them, and he and Clara conducted a careful, mutual examination of each other for approximately 4 months before anyone else noticed what was happening. Maggie noticed first, because Maggie noticed everything. She did not say anything to Frank for another 2 months until she was completely certain. Then she said at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, because she conducted most of her significant communications at breakfast, "Clara is falling in love." Frank put his coffee cup down. "With who?" "Daniel Ray's," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "He's a good man." "He is," she agreed. "She could do worse." "She could do considerably worse," Maggie said, "and won't, because she is who she is." Frank was quiet for another moment. Then, "She's 20. "She is," Maggie said patiently. 20 years old, and I would remind you, the most capable individual on this ranch." "That's not the point," he said. "Frank," she said, with the particular gentle directness she reserved for when he was being exactly the kind of father he had never expected to be. "She picked him from a corral of options, essentially. She knows what she's choosing." He looked at his wife across the breakfast table, this woman who had walked out of ashes and built something extraordinary, and who was now, at 43, more herself than anyone he had ever known. And he heard what she was not saying, which was that they had both done this once already and it had turned out to be the best possible thing. "Right," he said. "Yes, all right." "You might talk to him," Maggie said. "Daniel." Just a conversation. Frank talked to Daniel Ray's that afternoon, in the direct and honest manner of a former federal marshal who had spent years learning the difference between intimidation and genuine concern. He asked Daniel what he intended, and Daniel answered him with the same straightforward quality that Frank had observed in him from the beginning. "I intend to ask her," Daniel said, "when the time is right, if she'll have me." "The time is right when she thinks it is," Frank said. "You understand that?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "I do understand that." "Good," Frank said. And then, because he was who he was, "She is going to keep running this ranch regardless of whatever else happens in her life, and the man she marries needs to understand that clearly." "Marshal Trask," Daniel said. He still used the title, out of a respect that Frank had stopped correcting. "I have been working for this woman for 7 months. I understand it more clearly than I understand most things." Frank looked at him. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. Clara said yes the following spring, which was 1896, on a Sunday afternoon between the morning feeding and the evening feeding because, as she explained to Maggie afterward, she was not going to let a proposal interrupt the horse's schedule, and Daniel had respected that. "Of course he did," Maggie said, "or you wouldn't have said yes." "Exactly," Clara said. They were married in October of 1896, at the ranch itself, because the ranch was the right place, in the same October light that had shone over the corral on the morning Maggie had told her daughter to pick any horse she liked. The ceremony was outdoors, with the mountains behind and the horses visible in the near pasture, and the whole county more or less in attendance, because the Merriweather Trask family had become, over the years, the kind of family that the community gathered around. Frank walked Clara to where Daniel was standing, and then he came back to stand beside Maggie, and he took her hand, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and they watched their daughter get married in the afternoon light. "She's happy," Maggie said quietly. "She was always going to be," Frank said. "She's too much like you to be anything else." Thomas, 17 and almost fully grown, stood at Frank's other side and was unexpectedly solemn throughout the ceremony in the way of young men who are feeling more than they know how to express. Rose, 13, was a little less solemn and a little more tearful, which suited her character precisely. The years that followed were full. The ranch grew under Clara and Daniel's management into something that would outlast all of them, a genuine legacy, the kind built from honesty and hard work and a deep respect for living things. Maggie remained involved but stepped back gradually, as a person does when the next generation is ready, relinquishing control not reluctantly, but with the particular satisfaction of knowing that what she had built was strong enough to stand without her holding it up. Frank, in his late 40s and then his 50s, became the person in the family who sat on the porch in the evenings and watched everything and said less than he thought, which was, he had come to understand, exactly what he was suited to. He was still physically capable well into his 50s. The ranch work kept him so, but the days of hard riding and urgent investigations were behind him, and he found he did not miss them. What he had instead was this: the evening light on the mountains, the sound of horses, the voices of his children and eventually his grandchildren moving through the rooms of the house and the wide open air of the land around it. And Maggie beside him, always, still the most interesting and alive and present person he had ever known, still capable of surprising him, still the first person he wanted to talk to about anything. Thomas did not go into law enforcement in the end. He went into medicine, which surprised everyone and perhaps should not have, because he had always been the one who noticed when an animal was hurting before anyone else did, and the instinct was the same in a different form. He studied in Tucson and then in San Francisco, and came back to the territory in his late 20s as a physician, which was something the county genuinely needed, and which made his parents proud in a way that had no adequate expression. Rose married a schoolteacher named August in 1902, when she was 14 years older than her school-age self and 27 years old and utterly certain, as she was about everything. August was a gentle, precise, extremely organized man, who was entirely unprepared for the experience of marrying into the Merriweather Trask family, but who adapted with a good humor and growing affection that endeared him to all of them within the first year. Clara and Daniel had 3 children between 1898 and 1905, 2 boys and a girl, who called Maggie and Frank Grandma and Grandpa with the easy familiarity of children who have always known exactly where they are loved. Maggie Merriweather Trask, who had walked out of ashes at 28 with $40 and a 4-year-old and the absolute determination to survive, was a grandmother at 56, with a horse ranch that carried her name and her knowledge into a future she had built with her own hands. On an evening in the fall of 1908, she and Frank sat on the porch as they had sat on 1,000 evenings, with the light going gold and long over the land and the horses moving quietly in the far pasture. Clara and Daniel's oldest boy, James, who was 10, was in the near pasture with Copper Grace's 3-year-old granddaughter, practicing the patient groundwork that Clara had taught him and that Clara had learned from Maggie, and the teaching came all the way back in a circle. "He'll be good," Frank said, watching the boy and the young horse. "He already is," Maggie said. She was 61 now, and there were threads of silver in the dark auburn hair, and the years were written on her face in the lines of someone who has spent most of their life outdoors and working. And she was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they have grown fully into themselves. She looked at Frank beside her 62, his dark hair almost entirely gray, the quiet stillness still about him that had been the first thing she noticed, years ago in the lamplight of Emmett Yates' small house when she had first understood that this man was going to matter to her, and she felt what she had felt for 27 years now, the particular combination of gratitude and love and recognition that was the architecture of a long and good marriage. "Frank," she said. "Maggie," he said. "That was the right thing," she said. "Every bit of it, the long way around, all of it." He turned to look at her with the full attention he had always given her, the kind that made her feel, every time, that she was the most important thing in his immediate world. "Yes," he said simply. She reached over and took his hand, which was warm and familiar and entirely right, as it had always been, and they sat together in the evening light and watched their grandson teach a young horse the first patient lessons of trust. The sun went down over the Arizona territory in a wash of copper and gold, and the horses moved like dark shapes through the last light, and the ranch stood solid and permanent around them, built from loss and courage, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had refused to accept the story that had been written for her and had gone out and written her own instead. This was how it had ended. This was how it had begun. This was how it went on. Maggie Merriweather Trask had told her daughter, on a clear October morning in 1882, to pick any horse in that corral because her mama had earned them all. She had earned considerably more than horses. She had earned this life, this man, this family, this land. She had earned the right to sit on this porch in the evening with the one person who had come alongside her when it mattered most, and watch the next generation carry everything forward, and know in the core of herself that it was going to be all right. It had been earned, and it was real, and it was hers.